Recently, I have been noodling on this idea of positive versus negative motivation. And the reason for that is because I'm a big believer in what I call intuitive work, which is this idea that as you go about your day to day, you are constantly checking in with yourself of what is it that feels right for me? And how can I carry out those instructions based on whatever it is that feels right for me? How can I carry out those instructions given the environment that I live in, the circumstances that I'm in? How can I honor what it is that feels right for me despite all of the shoulds and societal expectations, etc.? And I have found that to be incredibly fulfilling in my life. But there's this expression that I have heard that makes sense to me, which is a cockroach will ruin a bowl full of cherries, but a cherry does nothing for a bowl full of cockroaches. And this is essentially talking about the idea that our mind or our brain has a proclivity to prioritize the negative. And this is evolutionary. It is actually important that this is the case, because if our brains didn't do that, then we would, and we prioritize the positive, then we would not prioritize things like a tiger coming to hunt us in the wild. So it is definitely adaptive. It is a way that we have learned how to survive, which is good and useful. The problem is that in our modern day life, there are less tigers. There are less things that are life-threatening that we absolutely need to focus on. Our brain is wired for survival, not happiness. And so in order to find happiness, fulfillment, all that good stuff, it actually sort of requires working against the way that our brain naturally works, which is really weird to think about. So basically, this question has been stewing in my mind of like, well, given that our brain has this prioritization toward the negative, is it actually better to, to prioritize motivation through pain and things like that? That was the question that kept running through my mind. Would it be better to just, put yourself in circumstances where you are forced to adapt because that is such a powerful motivator? So I've been talking with a bunch of people about this question of, what is actually the better way to motivate yourself? Is it better to motivate yourself through pain, or is it better to motivate yourself through these things like, passion and purpose and, all this aspirational stuff that you hear all the mental healthy people talk about? And the conclusion that I've come to after asking a whole bunch of people and talking to a whole bunch of people about this is that it depends, which is always the answer to the question. But I'll explain what it depends on, because I think that'll provide some insight. I think that when it comes to, like I was talking about, survival, pain is actually the most powerful motivator. So like, if you are worrying about paying rent at the end of the month, if you are worried about basic survivability, if you are not going to have a roof over your head, if you are not going to have food on your table, then pain is the most powerful motivator. You do whatever you need to do in order to pay the rent, get food on your table, put food in your mouth, feed your kids, whatever it is. That is, in my experience, talking with a bunch of different people, the most powerful motivator. And you will sort of do whatever you need to do in order to get that done. A good example of this is like when somebody loses their job, all of a sudden, the motivation to job hunt spikes. Even if they were absolutely miserable at their job, absolutely hated their job, weren't happy with it, but they never job hunted until they got fired, because all of a sudden, then the pain kicked in. Then it was like, oh God, if I don't get a job, then I'm not going to be able to pay my bills, I'm not going to be able to feed myself, I'm going to end up homeless, etc. Fear, pain as a motivator to do something like job hunt, and all of a sudden you're, putting in 50 applications a day. Now, that goes all the way up. So I often visualize our mental health journey sort of like a number line. So you have the negative part of the number line, which is when you are below function, when you cannot function in your day-to-day life. And then there's 0, which is baseline. 0 is, I am now a functional member of society. I can pay my bills, I can work my job, I can feed myself, all that good stuff. But that doesn't mean that I'm happy or fulfilled or at peace or any of these things. So there's baseline. And then there's this whole, from 0 to 100 is fulfillment, right? So pain works as a motivator all the way up until 0. Once you reach 0, something switches, which is that if you continue to try to use the fuel source of pain, fear, sort of negative reinforcement as a motivator, what will end up happening is that you will still accomplish. So for instance, a good example of this is I've worked with people who are very successful, either, software developers or investment bankers, basically jobs that pay very, very high salaries. And the reason that they got these jobs was out of these negative motivators. It was like, I never want to be poor. I want to make sure that, I have all the money in the world. I want to make sure that I'm safe and secure. I want to do the right thing. I want to do what I should. I want to, follow the rules of society. And what ends up happening is as they do that, they do actually accomplish a lot. They become very successful members of society, but it feels hollow. It feels empty. They are not fulfilled at all in that pursuit, which is why they end up talking to me, because they come to me and they're like, my life looks great on paper, but I'm still miserable. And this is what happens when you use pain to get you from 0 to 100, is that it still winds up hollow and empty, because what you are doing is you are maxing out your survivability, which is great. It's great that you are very, very secure when it comes to survivability. But in order to find fulfillment, peace, etc., it requires a different fuel source, because that fuel source is corrosive. That fuel source, it allows you to survive, but it tears up your engine along the way. And it doesn't feel good to experience. Obviously, it's a negative motivator. So then a switch happens. Once you get to 0, a switch has to occur, which is that all of a sudden you have to start motivating yourself through things like purpose, passion, etc., the things that all the mental healthy people talk about. And the reason for that is because otherwise it'll feel hollow. And what's interesting is that our brain is not wired for that. Our brain is not wired to motivate ourselves that way. It is actually a weaker motivator. Like I said, one cherry does nothing for a bowl full of cockroaches, right? And so it is actually a weaker sauce, which is why I think it is far harder to find fulfillment than it is to find survivability. Because you are, again, working against the natural way that your mind works. And the most recent part of our brain is the frontal lobe. And you are essentially using your frontal lobes to sort of put the brakes on or overcome the lizard brain, the rest of your brain, that says, no, we just need to survive. We just need to do what we need to do to survive. We need to stay in familiar environments that feel safe, because familiar equals safe. And if we go outside of safe, that's dangerous. That's bad. We don't want to do that. And so by starting to take these steps to work against the way that your mind naturally works, instead of motivating yourself through pain, you motivate yourself through these things like purpose, fulfillment, etc. And what ends up happening is that you start to feel more fulfilled. But it is really, really freaking hard, because you are working against all of your natural instincts. So this is sort of the overall conclusion that I have come to when it comes to this question of what is the best motivator? Is it to motivate yourself through negative emotions, negative reinforcement? Or is it better to motivate yourself with things like purpose, passion? And the answer is both, depending on where you're at in like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? You have like very basic function stuff, survivability stuff, and then you have, self-actualization, all that sort of higher level stuff. There's one other thing that I wanted to talk about within this, which is that I think that there's a trap within mental health, which is that you can get trapped in toxic positivity. So as you start to try to use passion, purpose, fulfillment, etc., what can end up happening is you wind up starting to dismiss the negative emotions that you experience. And that is a very, very dangerous trap, because what that ultimately results in is a whole lot of suppression, which then just leads to more problems down the line. Then you have to work out all sorts of stuff along the way. And so what I have found personally and with the people that I work with to be far more effective is this idea of alchemy. And what I mean by that is when you have some negative event happen, so you are a functional member of society, right? You can pay your bills, all that good stuff. Survivability is not an issue. But then as you go about your trying to find fulfillment, there are going to be negative experiences that you have. And the idea is actually not to dismiss those negative experiences. It is to acknowledge them and look at them objectively, and then root yourself in whatever it is that is driving you, in whatever the value, purpose, duty, dharma, however you want to phrase it, whatever the thing is that is driving you, sort of calling it back to that. It's sort of like in meditation, when you're focusing on your breath and your mind wanders and you call it back to your breath. It's the same basic concept, that your negative emotions are going to be there, and that is good and normal and natural. There's nothing wrong with negative emotions popping up, and acknowledging those is important. And then you call yourself back to, okay, so I'll give you an example. Let's say that you are working a job and they cut your salary, okay? And so all of a sudden you're making a whole lot less money. And here's the thing, it's still technically survivable. It's still enough money. But you can sort of see that the way that the cards are being laid out, things are not looking good for you. Still survivable, just not good. Like the direction that the company is taking, not a good direction. It's not going to end up well for you. And so then the question, so you have all of these negative feelings of like fear of, oh God, what's going to happen with this company? I'm mad at this company for cutting my pay, all these sorts of things. And then regrounding yourself in, okay, what is my duty here? What is my purpose here? What are my values here? How do I want to proceed given the negative stimulus that was just introduced to me? And by regrounding yourself in that, you feel the negative emotions and then you bring yourself back to what it is that is actually driving you. It helps you to acknowledge both simultaneously and sort of alchemize this negative emotion into something that is driving you through this positive force of, this is what, this is how I want to live my life. And so this is how I'm going to go about doing it. So as you go about this process, you're going to be learning a whole lot of things, because that's just how life goes. If we actually pay attention to what is going on as we are going about our day-to-day lives, we are constantly learning new things. And one of the most valuable practices that I have found when it comes to going through this process is the idea of documenting that process, because it just has all sorts of different advantages. And in this video, it'll either pop up here or down in the description, depending on where you watch this. In this video, I talk all about not only the advantages of documenting your process, but also how to do it. So if that sounds interesting to you, check that out. Hope that's helpful, and I'll see you next time. Bye.